What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I want to share 3 common jerkbait mistakes that anglers make in the fall. Let's get into it. The first mistake I see a lot of anglers make with jerkbaits in the fall is sticking with the standard 110 size jerkbait. The Megabass Vision 110 is the most popular jerkbait on the market, and there's a lot of other jerkbaits that have imitated its profile and length. It's a very useful jerkbait to have in the box, and I catch a lot of fish on it, but in the fall I find that a lot of times I can get a lot more bites by either going to a smaller jerkbait or a lot bigger jerkbait. On the smaller size, there's 2 baits I really like to throw. One of them is unfortunately discontinued. This is the Jackal Squirrel 79. I still have a bunch of them in the boat. It's a smaller profile jerkbait, though it actually has a little bit wider body to it than the Vision 110, which gives it a little bit different action. It kind of has more of a vibration to it, which I find is actually really appealing to the fish at times. And by being slightly smaller than that Vision 110, I feel like it just gives those fish a different profile they're not used to seeing. And that little bit smaller shad is a lot of times what bass are feeding on in the fall as well. So by going to that slightly smaller bait, you're going to generate, I feel like, sometimes more bites, especially in clear water and when the fish are going through that kind of fall turnover time. A bait I also throw a lot of is now the Megabass X Nanahan Plus 2. It has a very similar bill length to that Jackal Squirrel 79, and I would say it's the best alternative on the market to it right now. It's a really sleek profile bait. It's not as wide as that squirrel, so you can also pick up a few other baits. I think there's like a Lucky Craft version of this that I have tried before. I'm not honestly the biggest fan of it. It doesn't really work that well for me, in my opinion. I always prefer the Jackal Squirrel, and then I've preferred this Megabass X Nanahan Plus 2 as my alternative. But either way, both of these baits work extremely well to imitate those smaller shad, and I'm usually throwing these on a spinning rod and trying to work them down in that like 4 to 7 foot range. That's kind of where these baits excel. You can put them on lighter line, like 6-pound test fluorocarbon, and get them down into that like 8 or 9 foot range, especially if you weight them down. But I'm usually just trying to work them in like 4 to 6 foot, and they work extremely well. Have a pretty solid bill on both of them, so they're not going to break, and just really good smaller jerkbaits in general. Now, if you want to go bigger than your Vision 110, a couple of options that I like are the Smithwick Perfect 10 Rogue. This is actually the exact Perfect 10 Rogue, I believe, not the exact one, but the exact color that I caught my personal best bass on, a 10-pounder. And the fact that I caught my personal best bass on a $10 jerkbait is kind of interesting, just because a lot of anglers focus on buying the more expensive $25, $30 jerkbaits. So maybe the price doesn't matter as much as you would think, but that Perfect 10 Rogue is definitely a great bait. It is a bigger profile bait. It has a different rolling action than that 110 as well, which gives it just a different feel in the water to those fish. It doesn't cast as well as the 110. It doesn't have the best colors in it all the time, but it is a pretty good bait in general, and I catch a lot of fish on it. Obviously, I've caught my personal best on it and had like a 30-pound bag that day. Now, another bait that works really well, that casts way better than that Perfect 10 Rogue, is this Megabass. It's the 110 Max LBO. The LBO has this weight transfer system that's really interesting, and it like really rockets that weight through there, and you can see that big weight slides through. On the cast, it like pops down, and that allows this bait to cast a mile. The one thing about this bait that's interesting is it is a floating jerkbait, so unlike the Smithwick Perfect 10 Rogue, which is designed to suspend, this bait will float. And it's already pretty heavy, so to weight it down and get the weighting right so it suspends is slightly difficult compared to that Perfect 10 Rogue. So if you want a suspending jerkbait, you should go with the Perfect 10 Rogue, in my opinion. But if you're fishing in the wind and don't really mind a floating jerkbait or trying to work on weighting it, that Vision 110 Max LBO is definitely the way to go. A lot bigger bait than the standard Megabass Vision 110, and again, a little bit different profile. It has taller sides to it, so that makes it roll a lot more and it flashes a lot more. So just interesting bait and gives those fish a different look, and so I would highly recommend experimenting with different jerkbait sizes in the fall. The fish are going to be feeding, again, a lot of times on really small shad, but a lot of times they'll also be feeding on bigger shad, like bigger gizzards, and also brim and perch and things like that up north, especially as you get right before ice out up north. They'll feed on big perch, so those bigger jerkbaits can work extremely well. The second mistake I see anglers making with jerkbaits in the fall is always preferring a suspending jerkbait over a floating jerkbait. I mentioned earlier that this Vision 110 Max LBO is a floating jerkbait. I actually really like that for a lot of scenarios because it allows you to fish this bait around a wider variety of cover than you can with a suspending jerkbait. With a suspending bait, once you work it down to depth, it's just going to hang there in the water column, or maybe just barely slowly rise up. Or with a floating jerkbait, it'll work down to depth and then rise up relatively quickly. Now, you don't want it to rise up too fast where it like goes straight back up to the surface extremely quickly, so you may need to change out maybe the front treble hook at times so it's kind of slowly rises, maybe like half a foot a second, a foot a second, so it's not going like crazy back up to the surface like a bobber. But having a floating jerkbait is really important a lot of times in the fall because bass are going to be setting up in shallower water. And if they're setting up around shallow laydowns that are in, let's say, less than 5 foot of water, or my favorite place to fish, shallow brush piles a lot of times that are in like, sometimes they'll top out like 5 foot, sometimes they're topping out even in 3 feet of water. Having a floating jerkbait is a great tool because you can twitch that bait down over that pile, let it float, twitch it over, let it float, and only allow that bait to get down a foot or two underneath the surface of the water so you don't actually get this thing hung up in rocks or wood or things like that and lose your $20 jerkbait. Now, you can also throw baits like a square bill or a jig, spinner baits in those same scenarios, but sometimes something about just a jerkbait with its longer profile, that slower rise in the crankbait, and that different action, that cutting action, can trigger a lot of bites. And I'm usually having one of these tied on, these floating jerkbaits, specifically this 110 Max LBO. This is my favorite like fall jerkbait by far. I like big baits. This bait floats, it casts a mile, and I'll have it paired up with few other baits like my standard crankbaits and things like that that I'll have tied on. And it is just a really effective tool for, again, fishing around shallow cover. You can fish it even down the sides of boat docks, up shallow. You can fish it over floating grass. You can fish it on bridge pilings around riprap. And I just don't think that many guys anymore are throwing a floating jerkbait because the trend is just suspending jerkbait. That's all you hear about. And a lot of times that's because guys are using this as forward-facing sonar. They're fishing them in the winter. Now I think the art of throwing a rising floating jerkbait has been lost. I actually grew up fishing up north and I always threw a Smithwick Rogue, and there was also a Strike King Golden Shiner jerkbait. There was a floating jerkbait that I threw a ton. I caught so many fish on it, and it was basically like a Rogue imitator, and they were both floating jerkbaits, and I threw them constantly. And I think that maybe just holdover from my days growing up in Wisconsin, throwing those baits and catching tons of fish have led me to continue to throw these floating style jerkbaits. I do like this jerkbait again because it casts really well. There are other jerkbaits like just a regular Smithwick Rogue that works, just a smaller size. It's hard to cast in the wind at times, and I prefer a bait that can cast well. Again, I will pick that Perfect 10 up. This actually casts pretty well because it's a bigger bait and it does have a small weight transfer system, though it's not all that much, but it does cast better than a standard Smithwick Rogue, though I still throw some of those too on calm days in the winter. I'll talk about that for my winter videos. I got some sneaky old school Rogue tricks for you where I've caught some big fish on those. But anyways, that's more for wintertime fishing. But anyways, floating jerkbaits, bunch of them on the market. Just check the description on Tackle Warehouse or on the package. Make sure you're getting the floating ones, not the suspending ones at times in the fall. Experiment with both, but that would be one of the bigger mistakes I see anglers make, is just not even paying attention to those floating jerkbaits. The third mistake I see anglers making with jerkbaits in the fall is actually kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of the last one, and that's not fishing jerkbaits deep enough. It's interesting, I always try to fish the extremes with any bait, whether that is a bigger version of the bait, or trying to fish a bait shallower than guys do, or fish a bait deeper. Usually if you can get to the extremes, you're going to present the bait in ways that anglers haven't and that the fish aren't used to seeing, and you're going to usually get better results. The bait I try to fish deeper with is a Megabass Vision 110 +2 jerkbait, and I'm doing this specifically with forward-facing sonar because I can watch the bait sink down deeper. What I try to do is actually weight these baits to sink. So the way I'm going to do that is in two different ways. The first is adding a bigger hook to the front hook hanger. This is a Gamakatsu size 4 EWG. And by adding that to that front hook hanger, depending on the water temperature and everything you have going on, this bait will slowly sink, allowing me to get it down sometimes as deep as 15 feet of water, but other times as deep as 25 to 30 feet of water, depending on the situation. Another way you can weight these jerkbaits is, again, changing out that front hook for a little bit bigger hook, but also adding a small second split ring to that front hook hanger. That will add some weight to it and not interfere with the hook. I don't like wrapping lead wire around my hooks. I've always just not enjoyed doing that. It can kind of come off and I think it looks kind of unnatural. So I always try to upgrade the hook size and add that split ring off the front. That always allows me to weight that bait down. And you can increase the weight as much as you want, as fast as you want these baits to sink. And I always weight the front hook hanger so that bait floats nose down, because if you weight it so that it floats neutral or tail down, when you go to jerk it next to a brush pile or a rock pile or whatever, you're just going to pull those hooks straight into the cover you're trying to fish and you're going to get hung up. Or if it's weighted nose down and you then hit that brush pile or whatever, it'll hit the nose of the bill first and then come on over. So that's kind of why I weight the front first. But in the fall, a lot of times, especially like in October and into November, you're going to have fish that are still pretty deep. Let's say on clear lakes, you'll find fish in 30 or 40 feet of water at times. And on clear water lakes, these fish will come up out of deep water to destroy a jerkbait, especially smallmouth and spotted bass. And I've found that I can weight my jerkbaits down so that I get them down into the 15 to 20 foot range before working them. That means I'm casting them past the object, I'm reeling them down to depth. This bait gets down about 7 to 8 feet on a normal cast after you reel it, maybe 10 to 12 cranks. It gets down pretty deep, pretty quick. And then once it's down like at 7, 8 feet, I'm gonna wait for that bait to sink. If I have to sink it down to like 20 feet of water, I'll weight it so that I have enough weight on the front with changing out the hooks and adding split rings that it falls at a foot per second. So that means I only have to wait 10, 12 seconds for it to get down to that 20 foot of water range. If I only need to get down to like 15 feet or like 12 feet, I will weight it so it only falls like half a foot a second, so I don't have to wait that long. And it still isn't falling like a rock. You want it to fall as slow as you can, because when you work it in front of those fish, if they start following it, you don't want it to fall straight to the bottom like a rock in front of them. That will mess them up. But if it's falling at a foot per second or less, you're good to go. And basically then I'm just going to work that bait down to the level of the cover, but try to keep the bait within or above the level of those fish by 10 feet. So if my rock pile, my standing timber, my brush pile is topped out at 25 feet of water, I'll work that bait down to 15 feet. If it's topped out in 30 feet of water, I'll work that bait down to 20 feet, so on and so forth, to keep it 10 feet above the level of those fish. That will then cause those fish to come up and try to eat the bait and create that distance, but they'll feel that bait moving with the lateral line, they'll hear the hooks and the weight and stuff moving around, they'll come up and just absolutely crush it. And a lot of guys are throwing swim baits, Demiki rigs, drop shots, things like that on those deeper fish, and they're not throwing a jerkbait. So having a bait that you can throw that's completely different from what other anglers are throwing in that depth zone can be extremely effective. And again, it's working the margins basically. Throwing a floating jerkbait that you can work higher in the water column that moves differently from a suspending jerkbait. Throwing a jerkbait like the Vision 110+2 where you can weight it and get it deeper. Or by throwing smaller jerkbaits or bigger jerkbaits than what everyone else is throwing. I think that you could summarize this whole video in terms of that with the mistakes is that anglers just all throw the same thing, which is maybe a faster way to discuss this video, but it wouldn't get into all the details. And if you are going to think about any sort of bait that you're going to be throwing, try not to just take whatever is stock on the shelf and just throw it. Think about different ways to utilize your baits, different ways to implement your strategy, whether that is throwing baits where other anglers aren't throwing them or working them in depths, ways, retrieves, things like that that anglers aren't doing. And it's going to result in a lot more fish catches for you throughout the year, not just in the fall, just any time of the year. And I'll give you more of these adjustments I make depending on the season and things, because I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, way more time than I probably should. Just messing around my tackle box. I mean, I have this whole tackle box of jerkbaits that is weighted different ways, and I will unweight and reweight these jerkbaits every season and take hooks off and move stuff around. So like I'll mess with these jerkbaits constantly. I have a big box of them. So This is like one of my jerkbait boxes too. I have like 6 jerkbait boxes. I'm addicted to jerkbaits. I have way too many, but I've caught a lot of fish on jerkbaits too over the years, so that's why I have so many. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and learned something about some of these jerkbait mistakes. Let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed. Also make sure to use the links down in the description. It helps give me a small percentage of the profits of all of your purchases on Tackle Warehouse. You can also bookmark my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link down there. And if you bookmark that affiliate link to your bookmarks bar, every time you go to Tackle Warehouse and then check out, I'll get a small percentage of the profits. Really appreciate that, and it's a great way not to forget to use the links. So other than that, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you all next one.